Welcome to the second part of our discussion. We will talk about the mechanisms of defense. When did it started? Who started this type of mechanism? And why do people have this type of defense mechanism? Anne Freud is the youngest child of Sigmund Freud, who trained as a psychoanalyst and went on to be one of the pioneers of child analysis. She elaborated and refined her father's ideas about the role of defense mechanisms. Of course, it's the father, si Sigmund Freud who started it, and then nung wala na si Sigmund Freud, Anne Freud refined and continued the project. This increasing attention to the ways in which the ego defends itself against emotionally threatening unconscious impulses and wishes represents an important step away from original biological-oriented psychoanalytic drive theory in the direction of an ego psychology that gave more emphasis on cognitive processes. The key defense mechanism described by Anne Freud in her book The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense included. So, ang pinaka-focus talaga dito is defending the ego talaga in terms of defense, this type of defense mechanism. So, it's Anne Freud who do it, and we will be discussing the 9 defense mechanism that she added and explained and even refined it. Why do we need these ego defenses? We use defense mechanism to protect ourselves from feelings of anxiety or guilt which arise because we feel threatened or because our id or ego becomes too demanding. Defense mechanism operate in a conscious level and help ward off unpleasant feelings or make good things feel better for the individual. Imagine that one, guys, when we say defense mechanism pala, hindi lang siya basta-basta sasabihin mo lang na, defense mechanism mo lang yan. It's actually operate in an unconscious level that we don't really know is happening. And this type of mechanism has a positive or advantage then for us to really help us to ward off yung mga unpleasant feelings that we have. Kaya yung ego defense mechanisms are natural and normal. And when they get out of proportion, neuroses develop such as anxiety states, phobias, obsessions, or hysteria. Kaya dito, once you become a counselor or a psychologist talaga or even psychotherapist, you should be able to explain it in your own and understand this type of situation wherein a client or a person is having a defense mechanism. I have here an example, guys, that I'll be discussing later on at the last part, yung trial or case of Patty Hearst on the year 1976. This story, itong babae na yan, si Patty Hearst, was one of the famous na famous example about Stockholm Syndrome. Ano ba talagang nangyari sa kanya, kay Patty? And why is it for me na kailangan talaga natin siyang pag-aralan? Kasi, in the story, it is very irresponsible kasi to run or explain or having this knowledge about Stockholm Syndrome and we don't even know what's the reason behind. Kasi ang nangyari, dito sa story ni Patty, he was abused and raped by her captors. Then later on, nag-join siya dun sa Liberation Army na yon and even took part in one of their bank robberies. But what really happened after a couple of years and hours of doing the trial, she was acquitted because she was a victim suffering daw ng Stockholm Syndrome. And ayun, having this explanation or understanding in this part, kasi nasabi nila that's yung Stockholm Syndrome or what happened is a type of defense mechanism. Imagine that one guy studying this would actually help someone na imbis makulong, diba? We could help them out. Kasi this is more on mentality and talking about defense mechanism, we might be doing something that unconsciously just to avoid or iwasan yung mga anxieties natin. And that's the beauty of studying psychology talaga, that it's so fascinating and it's the lesson embedded in this case. Kaya mamaya, sobrang daming types of defense mechanism. And by the way, sa exam natin for the midterm, I will be including different types of cases or scenarios or situation wherein you will be justifying why is it that yung type of defense mechanism na yan is a natural one and also normal. Later on, magagawa natin yan. Kaya 'di ba dito sa story na to ni Patty Hearst, which is more on Stockholm syndromes, we all know lots of movies, guys, na halimbawa ng mga Stockholm syndromes are doing this type of ego defenses na like sa Wattpad, 'di ba? Imagine that one. We might be romanticizing this type of issues na abducting someone tapos falling in love with that person, 'di ba? Later on, we'll be talking about it and explain it. Sana magawa niyo yun during the exam. Let's start with the denial. It's a defense mechanism that proposed by Anna Freud, which involves a refusal to accept reality, thus blocking external events from awareness. We always have this type of defense mechanism, yung denial stage na to. In this way, an example talaga ng denial stage or this defense mechanism is many people use denial in their everyday lives to avoid dealing with painful feelings or areas of their life they don't wish to admit. That's true. Sometimes, nakakalungkot na nangyari but we are not showing any emotions at all or we don't know what we are going to say kasi nandun tayo sa part na to. Because we are avoiding this type of painful feelings. Kasi pag nasasaktan ka naman, di ba, may tao bang nagiging masaya? Of course, kaya nagiging we deny that it exists. An example, a husband may refuse to recognize obvious sign of his wife's infidelity. Or even a student may refuse to recognize their obvious lack of preparedness for an exam. Kaya minsan, i-deny na lang na, bahala na lang si Batman or I don't even care kung lalabas ba or mataas yung grade ko or babagsak ako. Minsan, mababa yung exam, di ba? We don't really accept the scores kasi we have that denial stage. And dito sa stage nito, husband may refuse to recognize obvious signs of his wife's infidelity. Kasi nga, it's in denial. Kasi, yun yung sinasabi ko, that person is dealing to avoid that painful feelings. Kaya hindi na ina-admit, di ba? Kasi, ikaw ba naman, may asawa ka, tapos may anak ka, di ba? Sometimes, you really wanted to save the relationship, lalo na if you're in a marriage part na, di ba? Kaya minsan, dyan nagkakaproblema. Dito sa denial stage na to, I have here some examples. Or we could ask this within ourselves if it's true or not. Do you fantasize about how you wish things were, or if only she or he would do it? Ayan. Doon, pag magsasagot yung client natin, nasa stage ba siya ng denial? Do you doubt your own perceptions about someone? Kasi pag may doubt siya, then that's in the stage of denial. And do you minimize your hurt? Yan. Ito yung medyo mabigat talaga or lalabas talaga if you are in this type of defense mechanism. Kasi if you are minimizing your hurt feelings, minimize mo yung sarili ng masaktan, you have this type of mechanism. And do you rationalize bad behavior? Do you believe broken promises? Are you willing for some event to change things? Do you hide someone's accusing behavior or bad behavior? They continually hoping things to improve. So if your answer is yes, then you are in the stage of denial. If most of the questions are in the yes, so meron kang defense mechanism na to. But as what I said, this type of defense mechanism is normal since people would really avoid this type of painful feelings. But it would also provide something for the person, pag nabawa sa counseling, lumabas na meron siyang defense mechanism na ganito, if he or she will be guided by the counselor or naparanas sa kanya, kasi unconsciously, nakahide yun eh. But let that client reflect or realize that it really happened. And then you will be able to help that person. And in the denial stage din kasi, or the denial defense mechanism, if a situation is just too much to handle talaga, the person may respond by refusing to perceive it or denying that it exists, lalo na pag alam niya sa sarili niya na sobrang masasaktan siya pag i-admit niya. Halimbawa, kung yung karelasyon nyo ay naglolo ka, diba? Then you are not trying to accept it. Nasa denial stage ka pa, kaya may mga chances na binibigay ang isang tao kahit sabihin nila, sus, once a cheater, always a cheater. But if you're in this denial na type of defense mechanism, since you don't want to feel hurt na mawala yung tao na yan, you will just refuse to admit it. Kaya, i-deny mo na lang that it actually existed. Kaya minsan naloko na pero parang wala lang nangyari after. And as you might imagine, this is a primitive and dangerous defense talaga. Itong denial. Kasi, no one disregards reality, diba? And gets away with it for long. Di pwedeng lagi nating iniiwasan talaga yung realidad. And it can operate by itself or more commonly in combination with others, more subtle mechanisms that support it. Kaya minsan, feeling mo hindi ka na masaya kasi there might be a denial part in you na hindi mo tinatanggap or iniiwasan mo. Kaya ito yung pinaka-dangerous talaga na defense mechanism. But we should not judge the person. Kaya diba pag psychology, sa ginagawa natin, we are trying to help the client. Kung i-understand niya, bakit ganito ka? Kasi we are providing them, parang there would be a rational thinking na, ginagawa ko pala to kasi because of my defense mechanism. Ayun. Hindi natin sila i-judge as abnormal or hindi naman nag-iisip to, parang tanga or sorry for the term. Pero minsan, di ba, yan yung sinasabi natin. Talino ka sana, kaso di ka naman nag-iisip o hindi mo ginagamit yung utak mo. Kasi, this one. This could be this type of defense mechanism, which is very dangerous. And then we have the second defense mechanism, which is the repression. It is an unconscious defense mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. Repression. I have here an example of repression. The Oedipus complex aggressive thoughts about the same-sex parents are repressed and pushed down into the unconscious. Pag sa repression naman kasi, according to Freud, it identified na sa case na isang 5-year-old little Hans, yung tawag niya, whose father reported about him and his fear of horses through letters to the psychoanalyst. Freud believed that the boy was experiencing an Oedipus complex. Kaya meron siyang hatred sa father daw niya kasi nga he has this competing to be the sole focus of affection of his mother and resenting the attention that his father received from her. Kaya minsan ganito, meron siyang aggressive thoughts about the same-sex parents kasi meron siyang Oedipus complex. And in the repression then, it's an unconscious way, or this is not a very successful defense talaga in the long term. Kasi it involves forcing disturbing wishes, ideas, or memories into the unconscious, where although hidden, they will create anxiety. Imagine mo naman parang, di ba yung sa balloon, pag the more na dumadami yung nire-repress mo na hangin, pag hindi na kaya, di ba, sasabog at sasabog din talaga. And may appear through subconscious means and in altered form, such as dreams or slips of the tongue. Yan, sabi ko din kanina na it's more on, pag slips of the tongue, di ba, minsan nababanggit mo. Kasi nare-repress mo lang pala yung idea na gano'n. And we have the third one, the projection. It is a psychological defense mechanism that's proposed by Anna Freud, in which an individual attributes unwanted thoughts, feelings, and motives onto another person. Yung example ng projection I have it here, thoughts most commonly projected into another are the ones that would cause guilt, such as aggressive and sexual fantasies or thoughts. For instance, you might hate someone, but your superego tells you that such hatred is unacceptable. But you can solve that problem by believing that they hate you. Parang binaliktad mo, ibis ikaw yung nag-hate talaga sa kanila. But since of your superego tells that it's unacceptable, now sa kanila yung balik. Di ba may mga ganyang tao? Kaya minsan, uh, dito sa defense mechanism talaga, pag once na mapag-aralan natin siya, tsaka maintindihan. Later on, kaya 'di ba sabi ng mga psychologists, or for you to have a good mental health, don't always think or blame yourself. Kasi sometimes it's actually the person na nagbubuli sa atin or may sinasabing masama ang may problema. Just like this one, yung projection, 'di ba? Sila naman talaga yung may galit or may mali sa kanila, tapos na-project lang sa'yo, kaya ikaw tuloy yung masama sa kanila, sa paningin nila. And that's it. And this is thoughts that can cause us, for instance, you might hate someone, but your superego nga naman, yung sinasabi ko na unacceptable. And that's make it natural. It also happens to someone else. Kaya pag that person will be aware na meron siyang ganitong defense mechanism, then we could help the person out. And next is the displacement. It's a redirection of an impulse, usually aggression, into a powerless substitute target. The target can be a person or an object that can serve as a symbol substitute. This type of defense mechanism is really dangerous then, aside from the denial stage or dun sa repression. But also this one, pag displacement. Kasi, displacement occurs when the id wants to do something of which the superego does not permit. The ego thus finds some other way of releasing the psychic energy of the id. Thus, this is a transfer of energy from a repressed objects to a more acceptable object. Kaya pag dito sa displacement, halimbawa, may mga taong gustong magwala, 'di ba? Galit na galit sila. So they will express their anger, sinusuntok yung pader, or I even experience it in the sa field sa call center before. Pag galit na galit kami sa customer namin, nilalabas namin yung galit namin dun sa mouse, kaya nasisira yung mouse, or most of the time yun yung nasisira talaga sa call center, laging pinapalitan. And another example then is someone who is frustrated by his or her superiors may go home and kick the dog, beat up a family member, or engage in cross burnings. Kaya minsan, halimbawa, pag sa school ka or sa mga doctors, minsan, ang bait-bait nila pag nasa work kasi nandun yung boss nila. They would feel something na okay lang kahit pagalitan sila. But it will actually reflect pag uwi sila sa bahay. Ito yung sinasabing displacement. Kaya pag someone feels uncomfortable for a real person talaga, with i-express nila dun sa mababa lang or powerless na substitute target. Kasi minsan hindi nila nailalabas lalo na pag boss nila, 'di ba? Pag boss mo ayaw mong makapagsalita ng masama, or kahit gusto mo siyang suntukin, hindi mo pwedeng magawa. But once you go home, tada, doon mo lalabas pala yung anger mo sa ibang tao pa, pag sa family. Kaya mahirap din tong type of defense mechanism. But, understanding it could be a way. Kasi minsan, di ba, bakit kaya ganito? Kaya, itong defense mechanism is the explanation talaga. Once we ask someone na, bakit kaya to siya ganyan? Pag uwi ng bahay, galit na galit, kung ano-ano na lang ginagawa. Kasi, the action might be defense mechanism already. Okay? Nangyayari talaga siya. And the regression, it's a defense mechanism proposed by Freud, whereby the ego reverts to an earlier stage of development, usually in response to stressful situations. I have here an example. When we are troubled or frightened, our behaviors often become more childish or primitive. Totoo yan. It also happens to me sometimes na pag you are troubled talaga, lalabas talaga yung pagka-childish mo. And a child may begin to suck their thumb again or wet the bed when they need to spend some times in the hospital. Kaya normal talaga siya or it's something that parang natural siya pag yung isang bata, 'di ba, sa hospital, lalo na kung takot na takot siya. Syempre, he or she will do something na kung saan siya nako-comfort, like sucking the thumb or wetting the bed. Or even teenagers may giggle uncontrollably when introduced into a social situation involving the opposite sex. Parang nagiging bata daw ulit once we say regression. Kasi pag regression talaga, it functions as form of retreat, enabling the person to psychologically go back in time to a period when the person felt safer. Pag halimbawa, dati kasi safe siya pag nakatamsak siya. And then there's, kahit nawala na siya, pero kaya wag nating, di ba, pag minsan, pag sobrang kabado yung bata, frightened na nga, tas doing something like this, defense mechanism, sucking the thumb, tas pinalo natin na pinalo, that could cause trauma to them, lalo pag ganito nga, may mga frightening situations. Kasi that might serve as the comfort, tapos gagalit ka pa, diba? And then, let's go to the next, the sixth one, sublimation. Ayan, favorite ko tong sublimation. I'm doing this one. It's similar to displacement, but takes place when we manage to displace our unacceptable emotion into behaviors which are constructive and socially acceptable. Yan, tandaan nyo, pag displacement, negative, pero pag sublimation, it's a positive kasi we are displacing it or we are expressing what we feel in a constructive and socially acceptable rather than destructive na mga activities. Sublimation is one of Freud's original defense mechanism. So, hindi talaga siya kasama sa binigay ni Sigmund Freud. It's Anna Freud to think about this. An example dito is many great artists, musicians have unhappy lives and have used the medium of art and music to express themselves. Sport is another example of putting our emotions into something non-constructive. For example, fixation at the oral stage of development may later lead to seeking oral pleasures as an adult through sucking one's thumb, pen, or cigarettes. Kaya minsan, di ba, pag may mga sobrang addict na talaga sa cigarettes, there's a reason behind that. Sabi nga nila, meron daw sa oral stage fixation daw yun sa stage na binigay ni Sigmund Freud, and then also fixation during the anal stage may cause person to sublimate their desire to handle with an enjoyment of pottery. Pero pag dito sa sublimation, di ko malilimutan na sinabi ni Sigmund Freud that this is one of the best na defense mechanism talaga because it's advantageous dun sa mga tao, and this is something that sana meron ang mga client natin. Kaya minsan, di ba, pag may galit sila, we could provide mga activities or they could express it through songs, writing a poem, writing a book, para doon nila mailabas yung true feelings nila. And we have the rationalization. It's a defense mechanism naman, also proposed by Anna Freud, involving a cognitive distortion of the facts to make an event or an impulse less threatening. We do it often enough on a fairly conscious level when we provide ourselves with excuses. Yan, pag rationalization, hindi siya sa unconscious. It's on the conscious level when we provide ourselves with excuses. An example here is when a person finds a situation difficult to accept, they will make up a logical reason why it has happened. For example, a person may explain a natural disasters as God's will. Like now, yung dahil sa pandemic, but it's a good thing, kasi you're seeing a positive side of it. But it's also a form daw of a defense mechanism. Kasi imagine that one, if you're focusing the pandemic as somewhat like na threatening talaga always, diba, it could really cause so much anxiety. But having this rationalization talaga, taking a look or looking at the positive side din talaga, would actually help us. But still, it's a defense mechanism, diba? Kasi for many people with sensitive na egos, making excuses comes so easy that they never are truly aware of it. In other words, many of us are quite prepared to believe our lies. Minsan sabi na baka hindi talaga kami para sa isa't isa. But deep inside, you know that there's something na painful feelings that you might be hiding. Pero nasa atin na yan. If we accept it, accept the truth, then the reaction formation, it's a psychological defense mechanism in which a person goes beyond denial and behaves in the opposite way to which he or she thinks or feels. And by using the reaction formation, the id is satisfied while keeping the ego in ignorance of the true motives. And pag sa reaction formation, it's the id yung pinapairal natin, sinasatisfied natin si id. And the therapists often observe reaction formation in patients who claim to strongly believe in something and become angry at everyone who disagrees. Mag-disagree ka sa kanya, there would be reaction formation. Halimbawa nito is that Freud claimed that men who are prejudiced against homosexuals are making a defense against their own homosexual feelings by adopting a harsh anti-homosexual attitude which helps convince them of their heterosexuality. Ayan, baka sabi nila pag halimbawa, if ikaw as a guy is so against ka sa mga homosexual, so you will be saying bad or harsh attitude towards them without knowing kasi meron ka din pala inside of you na tinatago mo na ganun ka. Kasi minsan diba ganun tayo na galit na galit ako sa ugali mo kasi nga nakikita mo din pala yung sarili mo doon sa taong yan. Yun yung sinasabi na reaction formation. Kaya tanungin natin yung sarili natin kung ang ginagawa ba natin is a type of reaction formation or defense mechanism na ba yan? Because behind that, it tells a lot, di ba? Kaya pag mga psychologists or someone who really are analytic or very observant talaga, makikita mo na bawat galaw ng taong kasama or someone na ino-observe mo, makikita mo, yung ginagawa niya is a type of defense mechanism. Kakaroon siya ng reaction formation. Diba? Having this understanding talaga would really make us believe. Pero, this is only sa psychodynamic approach, ha? Sa inyo na yan kung anong type of approach talaga yung gagamitin niyo in the future. But we'll be studying more or different approaches pa naman na pwede natin yung gamit. But now, you can practice this type of approach in our counseling. And we have the last one, the identification with the aggressor. This identification with the aggressor is a defense mechanism talaga that's proposed by Sandor Ferenczi and later developed by Anna Freud. It involves the victim adopting the behavior of a person who is more powerful and hostile towards them. Kaya dito pumapasok yung sinabi ko kanina, the Stockholm Syndrome. An extreme example is the Stockholm Syndrome where hostages establish an emotional bond with their captors and take on their behaviors. Imagine that one, that's a form of defense mechanism pala. Like Patty Hearst, diba, was abused and raped by her captors. Tapos hanggang sa kasamahan na niya na naging sa bank robberies in her trial. However, in the end naman talaga, pinakawalan siya because of this Stockholm Syndrome. Diba? That's how powerful and amazing psychology is in terms of this. Studying the reasons behind why these people acting that way and that we could provide rationalization or explanation about it. Dito kasi kay Patty Hearst na trial, I'll be telling you what really happened about it, but you could search it. Meron sa YouTube or meron din siya other explanations about this. Sabi kasi dito, what really happened, yung type of this defense mechanism is internalizing daw kasi yung behavior ng aggressor. The victim hopes to avoid abuse as the aggressor may begin to feel an emotional connection with the victim, which leads to feelings of empathy. Kaya pag dito, nade-develop yung empathy ng isang tao eh. Halimbawa, di ba, kaya sinasabi ko na stop romanticizing this type of romance or love na kung saan namumugbog yung lalaki tapos okay lang, or the most of the movies, I hate that type of movies talaga or genre na yung abductor naging love tapos yung romanticize tapos parang okay lang nang nangyari yon. But this one guys is a true explanation talaga kung bakit kailangan nating iwasan or we have to help that individual or yung victim. And even itong trial ni Patty Hearst talaga, sobrang tagal niyan bago siya, nakulong pa nga siya bago siya pinakawalan eh. There are lots of things that happened. Sabi nga nung nanay niya, he expressed the confidence that her daughter would not face imprisonment. Kasi I don't believe Patty or my daughter legal problems are that serious. Kasi dati, mabait naman daw na bata. And then, after all, she's primarily a kidnapped victim, di ba? She's a victim. Kaya minsan, nakakainis yung yung biniblame mo yung mga victims, di ba? Sila na yung kawawa. Tapos, alam ko ba? But you as counselors or future psychologists or psychotherapists, we have to understand them this way. And we should be able to defend and justify why we should protect these people. Kasi the defense of Hearst talaga was headed by Bailey and his associate. They choose to adopt the strategy of attempting to prove that Hearst had been brainwashed and suffered from what has been variously called the Stockholm Syndrome. And these sufferers are captives who, after a period of being utterly dependent upon their captors, become sympathetic to their captors' cause. Under Bailey's theory, Hearst was never a free agent or a voluntary member of this type of yung liberal army na yun, di ba? So in the first place, hindi naman siya sasama kung hindi siya na-kidnap. Hindi naman volunteer na sumama siya, di ba? Na maging part siya. Kasi there's a reason behind it. That person or this girl actually wanted to, that's a defense mechanism na niya. Para karoon na siya ng empathy or gusto niya magkaroon ng emotional connection dun sa na-abduct sa kanya, di ba? Kaya nagkakos ng empathy. And after that talaga, sobrang daming nagkikritik din na that's not acceptable. Kasi andun siya, kitang-kita dun sa picture. May hawak pa nga siyang baril, hindi naman daw siya napipilitan. And then, yung suggested din that she was acting freely, hindi naman siya tinutulak or pinipilit, and it was not necessary to case. Critics noted to establish that Hart remained brainwashed throughout the entire time for her arrest, rather only that she was not a free agent at the time of the robbery. Tapos second then, yung brainwashing daw kasi was not recognized as a defense to bank robbery under federal law. Kasi, ayun eh, paano lang pag lahat na daw ng tao gagawing rason yan, na-brainwash kasi ako kaya dapat hindi ako nakukulong. Yun yung gusto nilang or pinaglalaban nila. But then, yung psychiatrist people entered the scene. They played a central role talaga in her courtroom drama. Kaya sobrang sumikat din to, or one of the best example for the Stockholm Syndrome. And Hearst was sentenced to 7 years. By the way, after yung mga psychiatrists they even listened to 200 hours of expert psychiatric testimony. But no one believed. Parang ayaw nilang maniwala doon. And Hearst was sentenced to 7 years in prison, and President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence to time served in February 1979. Hearst gained her release from prison after just 22 months. Imagine that one. It was on January 20, 2001, the last full day of his presidency, si Bill Clinton, tapos granted by yung kay Hearst a full pardon. Dalawang president talaga yung tumulong sa kanya para makawala siya. Binigyan siya ng full pardon. Of course, yung mga president naman have the rights to do so. Okay, di ba? Ganun kaganda ang pag-aaral ng ganito para ma-explain natin or justify natin kung bakit kailangan tulungan natin yung taong yan. Because they might be doing the right thing. Kasi dahil sa mga problema. And this one talaga, I would add another example pala dito sa Stockholm syndrome na to. Yung kay Mary Mcleod, ang nangyari sa kanya is she was abducted then. Tapos after that one, nung nahuli yung mga nag-abduct sa kanya, tapos they will be provided death penalty. Pero ang ginawa niya, si Mary, bumivisit talaga siya dun sa mga taong nagpahirap sa kanya. Kasi nga, she developed empathy towards them. Tapos, alam mo yung after that abuse na ginawa sa kanya, na-develop yung empathy. Imagine that one, nag-visit siya. Tapos, dahil nabigyan na ng death penalty yung mga taong nag-abduct na yun sa kanya, she committed suicide para lang i-prove na dapat pakawalan nyo na sila kasi nga wala naman silang ginawa na masama sa akin. Actually, they were the people who let me feel na hindi ako bobo or sila lang yung parang nagmahal sa akin. Diba? Imagine that one. How would it affect a person if we are having this type of defense mechanism within us na wala tayo sa tamang pag-iisip or there's a real reason behind why we acting that way. And that's the beauty or how amazing this type of defense mechanism na ginawa ni Freud. And it's something that we could support our client in the future and let them understand what they are doing or what they are thinking. I hope that you learn a lot for this topic and see you sa next discussion about conventional model naman. Thank you!